TRYX canceled the release of this $240 case after a review to try and fix issues like this.
Most build quality and assembly issues we've ever encountered.
God.
And now for our first test of the reworked case. There's people sweating right now at TRYX. Let's just see if that panel problem, it seems pretty fixed. Good start for TRYX. Much better. Now, about a year ago, we published our critical review of the TRYX LUCA L70, which is this case with a massive list of concerns with its quality. When the side vent is closed, the drive cage points SSD cables the wrong direction. The other SSD or hard drive bracket has raised areas that conflict with some of the 2.5-inch mounts. The front I/O cables are too short. Both the motherboard tray and the power supply cage use tiny flush head screws in addition to the thumb screws, so you have to use a screwdriver no matter what. The rubber cable grommets are easy to accidentally pop out and harder to get back in. The listed maximum power supply clearance is 190 millimeters, but that would bend the cables at a very sharp angle. Finally, the power button just sucks. Ew. Now that included everything from build quality to just factory quality control and actual design level oversight. In response, the company sent us this gigantic PDF detailing everything they'd changed in response to our review. This is a great approach to handling it, and we want to make sure they're acknowledged for taking the time to pause the launch and then try to address things. They still, of course, have to deliver on those changes and actually fix it, but the fact that TRYX was willing to entertain this at all is much better than a lot of other companies in the space, so credit to them for that. Now, unfortunately, the unit they shipped for reevaluation came with screws that had been knocked loose, the case has a bent hinge, and there are other problems, but we'll walk through each of these documented changes today. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Thermaltake TR100 Portable Mini ITX case. The TR100 case has a mesh ventilated front panel, heavily perforated side and top panels, and claims to support up to 280mm liquid coolers and large GPUs up to 360mm long and 70mm thick. It even has an optional suitcase with cutouts for the system, a mouse, keyboard, and monitor for transport. The Thermaltake TR100 Mini ITX case targets portable, smaller form factor PC building while maintaining compatibility for relatively large components. Learn more at the link in the description below. TRYX's L70 was an unusual case from a new company. TRYX used to mostly be known for its panorama cooler. Well, it still is mostly known for its panorama cooler, but it used to be too. TRYX's cooler has recently been copied by companies like Asus and Thermalright at Computex 2025, with Asus being particularly personal since some of TRYX's team came from Asus. More recently, TRYX showed off its Flova case with the possibility of adding a cross-flow fan to ATX, which was pretty cool and interesting on its own. But the point being that TRYX is interesting enough to its competitors that some of them are starting to copy it. But again, the L70 case was a really bad start for cases for the company, and to the company's credit, it did halt production while it implemented fixes. This is rare, but it has happened. Some examples of companies that have done this in the past include Fractal. Fractal actually has done it twice in the last 6 or 7 years or so. Once with the Mesh Phi 3, which was recent, where it held it due to reviewer complaints of PCIe slot tightness that triggered a pause. And then another time due to a fire hazard issue, where Fractal actually, right when the case was launching, pulled them all back to use a new PCB design. Today we're evaluating the L70's changes. The basics of the review remain the same. The features are pretty much all the same. The thermals are going to be the same. So most of the review is the same, and we'll leave that review just in the description if you want to learn about the basics, but we're going to focus on the very minute details today and the A/B changes. We'll start with the fasteners and the panel adjustment issues, since those were the most notable last time. Last time, we started by showing design oversights and build quality issues that were exaggerated by shipping damage that led to a cascade of failures with the top panel sagging, fasteners misaligning, the side panel coming loose, and then finally the side panel falling off and snapping and tearing out chunks of the case with it. Now, these issues stem from design problems, and actually a lot of the case was filled with design problems. Things like not being able to get an SSD, a SATA 2.5-inch cable in without it snagging on parts of the case. Things like this, which are not shipping related. But it felt like TRYX was repeatedly reframing lots of the complaints we had around shipping damage specifically. And that's just not the reality of what it was. A lot of it was design level issues, or design level issues that made shipping issues possible to begin with. And so we want to start there because the majority of our complaints last time were actually about design, quality of life features, quality control at the factory and not shipping. Shipping was just one part of what was otherwise a mess of a case, and again, it is the company's responsibility to ship things in a way that they get to you undamaged, and this has now gotten to us damaged twice, sometimes from factory level issues, sometimes possibly from shipping as well. But even when it comes to shipping in the original, the damage itself wasn't really the main problem, it was just the result of the problem. The fact that the case was vulnerable to damage was one item on a laundry list of other quality of life complaints we had. None of these were acceptable in a $240 case, and due to everything that's happened since September 2024, that MSRP has, actually understandably, increased to $250. TRYX stayed in contact over the months and provided us with a list of proposed changes, then a final overview of the actual production changes. Things like side panel attachment, drive brackets, cable lengths, grommets, and even the typo on the handle are part of a long list of changes from TRYX, but some things have remained the same, like a bent hinge on the new sample. So there's three categories of changes today from TRYX. There's the accepted changes, there's changes that weren't discussed, they're just new changes, and then there's rejected changes or things they opted not to modify. And again, this is going to be really minute, specific detail. This is not really a case review. The case review is already up, and that remains there for all the basics, all the background. This is going to be very focused and pinpointed. We'll start with the accepted changes. TRYX says that items like the massive gouges in the aluminum feet, the bent support for the SSD mounting bracket, deformed fan rails, damaged front I/O and power button area, bent motherboard tray, and similar things have been addressed with, quote, increased EPE material density to improve protection during shipping, end quote. Now again, we sort of disagree that the shipping's the main problem there, but we think what they're saying is probably true. It probably would improve the protection during shipping, but we don't have the original foam on hand to compare anymore, and the before and after pictures in TRYX's own documentation are actually the same photograph, but mirrored, so we're not sure why they did that. TRYX originally indicated that it intended to add extra warnings about fragility to the external packaging, but this wasn't included in the final change list. Our new sample arrived mostly unscathed with one exception. There was a severely bent lower hinge pin on the front panel. However, we again believe this one is probably a factory defect and not shipping damage. When the panel is opened, the pin pops out. This is a sample that TRYX sent directly to us, not an undercover purchase. So our confidence in the quality control at this point is non-existent. We also found that one of the motherboard standoffs was loose and just floating around in the case and stuck to a magnet somewhere else when we opened it, although every other standoff remained tight at least. But first of all, it's the company's responsibility to get a product out the door without issues. That includes QC when it's made, and that includes shipping and packaging to ensure it's not damaged. If it's a fragile product, it still requires care from the company making it, and it is still ultimately their responsibility to pack it correctly. And it's easy to hide behind shipping damage and throw a faceless, universally hated carrier shipping company under the bus as some sort of boogeyman for it. But the fact of the matter is, it is still the company's responsibility, and when it's happened twice in a row, there's something else going on. The TRYX reworked the side panel to try and deal with some of this, and companies obviously, although they're responsible, they do have a limit to their control over shipping damage. If UPS runs over the case with a box truck, there's only so much you can do. The bigger problem in our original review was that an impact on the corner of the case was likely to seriously damage its function. Specifically, the glass side panel was knocked out of alignment with the snaps of the case on the original. The snaps were too loose at the top of the case anyway, which was not a shipping thing, and all of this allowed it to flop out onto the table and tear chunks of metal out in the process. The major change here is, quote, positioning rivets on the glass panels for transportation, preventing chassis deformation, end quote. These rivets support the top panel when the side panels are installed and should keep the snaps correctly aligned, which is a solid improvement from TRYX that we're happy to see. The top panel itself doesn't appear to have been reinforced, unfortunately, but the rivets should be adequate as long as the glass panels are installed. In addition, TRYX says it, quote, removed the hovering function on glass side panel, end quote, meaning that the panel doesn't hang open on the studs, the parts that tore off. This seems like a wise trade-off to us. The hovering function isn't important enough to risk permanent damage anyway. A screw has also been added to the glass side panel to help secure it during transit. as well as a sticker warning about the presence of the screw. The screw is useful for carrying the case around or shipping it, and this is a good improvement. We've maintained that case panels should be securable with screws, if only for transit when they're made of glass. So we're happy to see this. Even still, with the addition of the rivets, we're comfortable removing the screw for daily use now. But like the damaged hinge, not every change actually addressed the problems. In the original L70, the motherboard tray and power supply were fastened with thumb screws and little flush head screws that required a driver, defeating the purpose of using the marketed toolless thumb screws since tools were required. TRYX made a partial change here. It explained that, quote, flush screws are included for transport reinforcement and can be removed once the build is complete, end quote, which is fine, but then it's not toolless. And its fix was to use larger, still not toolless screws, despite being marketed as toolless removal originally, quote, to avoid being inconspicuous, preventing users from overlooking them during use, end quote. We don't consider all of these screws optional, and we don't think they were inconspicuous, so this isn't a real change from our perspective. One of our other complaints of the issues in the original case was I/O cables that weren't long enough to easily be routed around the SSD bracket. The updated L70 has a 750mm USB Type-C cable, which translates to about 10 centimeters of additional usable cable length. Lengths for the other cables remain unchanged, but with our specific test bench hardware, all the cables are now able to reach, so that's good. The 10 centimeter extension fixes the issue. The metal strip that extended the motherboard tray in the original L70 would block cable cutouts at either the top or the bottom of the motherboard, depending on the case configuration. This was another major design oversight that had nothing to do with shipping. In the updated model, the strip has been cut away so that audio front panel and fan connectors can fit around it at the bottom of the case. EPS 12-volt cables have more room at the top of the case as well now, although it's still a tight fit. But again, these were good changes to something that was just a design problem. There was another one though. Another that we found on the original was the SATA cables would catch on the edge of the drive brackets, almost as if they had never been used before. This is in relation to the 2.5-inch drive functionality on the back of the case. Now, the mounting holes on the main drive bracket have been moved. The change fully fixes that issue. The power button was another issue on the original, mostly because it was hard to press in a really weird way. I mean, we're not snobs about power buttons. We have pressed probably thousands of them on different cases at this point, but I don't personally really care. It's not like a thing I'm not looking for like a mechanical keyboard response. What I am looking for is it's pressable with a normal amount of force, and when it does compress, it's not this like squishy weird, like it feels like something's broken response. And the good news is they've fixed that. TRYX at first defended the power button design as, quote, an anti-false touch function, end quote, to, quote, avoid accidental presses due to its edge location, end quote, which was a response to a complaint about just how awful the button felt. But they decided to change it anyway, and it's now been updated to work the way it looks like it's supposed to. The PCB is still marked as revision 1.0, so the only material change appears to be the removal of a small shim that was behind the button. We prefer the new version, and we think it's improved. Cable grommets were also a problem on the original, mostly because they were really easily ripped out and yoinked right through the case when you ran cables through it. The cable grommets have been molded from a stiffer material, likely a different durometer, and have been reshaped so that they're less likely to get dragged out by cables. This is a really subtle change, but it seems to have fixed that issue, and it's one that we're happy with. And now we get to the captive screws, or the not captive screws, depending on your perspective. And this is where we have some mixed feelings about the changes. Most, but not all, of the screws have been replaced with a new design with more thread, which TRYX says is, quote, for more intuitive alignment, reducing misalignment, and ensuring a smoother, faster installation, end quote. At the same time, a metal tab was added to the power supply enclosure, quote, for enhanced power supply chamber stability and an easier power supply shroud installation, end quote. But none of these are things we mentioned or had difficulty with, and they don't fix the actual problem with the captive screw situation. So the misused captive screw that needs to be uncaptivated to move the power supply shroud as part of the modular functionality, that's still present, and the motherboard tray is unchanged, despite TRYX's original intention to remove the embossing that can lead to the screws threading into both mating surfaces at the same time, something we pointed out originally. They showed an intent to fix it at first, and then didn't. So we still end up with misused and mismatched captive and non-captive screws, and screws that sometimes thread into multiple mating surfaces that just demonstrate issues with basics. Finally, the easiest thing to fix, the typo. going into the unknown. We talked last time about how companies really struggle with the word unknown. Like they need to just stop using it at this point. This includes Intel with Gunner twice with its Into the Unconwa video card that we reviewed. TRYX also struggled with this as it had the discovered and unknown on its handle. This has been fixed by redacting an additional letter, which just sort of obfuscates it and means that they don't have to remake all the handles. That was extremely low on our list of complaints, but since TRYX had to rebuild every case anyway, it made sense to take care of it, and we can appreciate that they bothered to. There were a couple small changes that TRYX made that weren't related to our review, which is a great sign. They were looking for other things. The ones reported by TRYX were, there were two of them mainly, a small set of translucent protectors on the edges of the bottom corners of the glass side panel. These were a nice touch that we appreciate. TRYX also added 8 hard drive screws to the main accessory kit, none of which were included previously, and they drilled 4 additional holes in the main drive bracket to improve hard drive mounting compatibility. So those were the additional sort of unrequested changes, and now we get into the final and third category, which is the rejected changes. So there's a bit of a list for these. There were some changes that TRYX opted not to make, and it defended its choices. We'll go through them. First off, the lack of fan screws. Quote, since no fan is pre-installed, we assume users will use screws that come with their own fans. Next, the crowded bottom of the case, which layers a fan bracket, the steel mesh of the chassis itself, its own built-in fan mounts, a filter, and then the aluminum base that obstruct airflow. Quote, this is a modular design case, and we considered scenarios where users might swap the power supply positions to try different configurations. In such cases, the additional fan tray becomes useful. Users don't need to unscrew fans or radiators. They can simply unscrew the captive screws and relocate the tray onto the top plate. In addition, this fan bracket allows easy installation of fans or radiators outside the chassis and can be offset to avoid interference with motherboard connectors. The detachable bracket allows users to remove it for enhanced airflow when necessary, end quote. I guess our response to that is, okay. We don't really disagree with what they're saying. It's not really relevant. The problem is the bottom of the case is completely obstructed for airflow, and it is one of the main places to get air into the case. This is a concern. There are plenty of cases that have modularity but can achieve it without needing to obstruct intake. And if TRYX wants to make a case that is just blocking the vast majority of a particular panel for air going into the case, that's fine. They're welcome to do that. There are lots of cases that intentionally restrict airflow because they're trying to go for something else instead, like looks, or just because they don't really know what they're doing. And that is a choice that TRYX can make, and that's fine. We don't disagree with what they're saying in the sense that I mean, all the things they said are true. It feels borderline non sequitur. Regarding the aluminum side panel and base, quote, this is part of the LUCA L70's IDE design. Thermal performance is important for this case. Okay, thermal performance is important for this case, but we also want to ensure its aesthetics appeal to its target audience. While there may be some trade-offs in terms of thermal performance, we believe the impact is within the tolerance range. The aluminum base reinforces chassis strength and serves an aesthetic purpose. It was modified with additional cutouts after Computex 2024 for increased air intake. That was after one of our complaints there too. Internal testing, they say, showed that removing the base results in a 1 degree Celsius difference in temperature, so the impact of performance may be negligible to most users, end quote. Now, we also saw this roughly 1 degree Celsius change from that aluminum base. But again, the thing we're really talking about here is the multiple stacks of not that porous metal, dust filter, fan bracket that obstructs. If you put a 140 fan in there, a lot of that area is getting eaten by the rails for the 120s, for example, and then the aluminum base at the bottom, which is really like the last in a list of complaints in a stack of airflow obstructions. So for us, it was really the totality of all these things. Now, otherwise, this statement basically aligns with what we said in our review. The version of the L70 we have here is sold based on looks. One of the things we said in the review was ignoring all of the other design issues and quality issues and design oversights and things like that. If you were looking for a case that was basically entirely looks focused, then it's kind of up to you. If you like it, great, especially now that they're starting to actually fix some of these things that we complained about in the first review, even better. So it's one of those, we get that it's not a thermal performance case. It needs to hit some baseline, and we'd still like to see striving for excellence in at least the panels where there is access to air. just to make the case that much better. And then, of course, when the mesh version of this comes out, and they do have one planned with the front being, I think it's 200s in the front, something like that, that one we're going to look at more critically for thermal performance. Now, in our review process, we do take into consideration that some people might just want the looks of the case, so we get that. TRYX also stated that, quote, the center base piece is detachable, allowing users to remove it when additional cooling is needed, which is technically true, but not worth considering. The cable cover and SSD mount towards the front of the case doesn't fit drives well in any configuration. This was something else we had complained about. TRYX made no changes here, but stated that, quote, in most scenarios, we recommend using the bracket behind the motherboard tray to mount SSDs, while the bracket to the left primarily serves as a cable cover, end quote. With our original sample, the bracket that fastened the power supply to the case was an extremely tight fit, the power supply itself was a tight fit, and 190mm power supplies, the max compatibility claimed, would not have enough room to comfortably fit cables and would block the cable cutout on top of the shroud. No changes were made here. They could at least kind of change the spec sheet for what it supports, but TRYX noted that the enclosure size was chosen to increase fan and radiator compatibility. Now, wrapping all this up, one thing we can appreciate is that TRYX addressed nearly every criticism we had in one way or another. They either accepted it and made a change. In some cases, though this was less common, they accepted it, but basically said can't do anything about it. And then there were some that they rejected, but they explained why, and that's fine. We can have a disagreement on why you might or might not do a thing in a case. But the fact that they did all three of these things, including even just like, yeah, we don't agree, here's why we don't agree. And then if we still don't agree, that's fine. Like at least, you know, they're kind of listening and engaging. We can respect that. So they attempted to fix several of the problems, and some of them were fixed really well. The simple addition of the studs to the glass panels adds significant structural stability to the biggest issue, and smaller quality of life changes, like the power button, the rearrangement of SSD mounting holes, reshaping the motherboard tray extension, and lengthening the USB Type-C cable are all upgrades and improvements addressing things we complained about. Now, of course, these are patches to an already existing case. Just some perspective here for the audience, but case tooling costs at least hundreds of thousands of dollars, and sometimes, I don't know what this one was, but sometimes it can cost $1 million plus. That's less common. It does happen. And those tools are what are fixed to machines to make and stamp the case and bend the metal and all that stuff. Making changes to tooling after it's already been made, the main way that a company can try to adapt without totally retooling is to basically modify existing tools. So this could be removal of material from the tool, such as if they're going to change, I don't know, the shape of something in a corner. They can add more places to drill holes through. They can fill in material to tools. This is not commonly a preferred practice because additive processes where you're adding to a tool that gets mounted to a machine, it introduces, at least as we've been informed by factories, but the factories have told us it introduces reliability concerns, and it can also introduce issues with just wear, where the tool in that additive area will potentially wear at a different rate than the rest of the tool. So I'm not a manufacturing expert. We've been to dozens of case factories, and this is what they've told us. So there's limited options for what a company can do without brand new tooling or making brand new tools for some panels. The end result, though, is that these are patches. That means it does not fundamentally alter the case, even though it does improve it. The case still does not compete strongly at its price in terms of ease of use or thermals. $250 now is more expensive than even the Haven HS420, which we like, and it's on par with the similarly styled Asus ROG Strix Helios, which we hated, but is built to a higher standard and comes with fans. Even the extremely expensive Fractal Meshify 3 Pro Ambience RGB is cheaper than the TRYX L70. The difference, though, is that at least with all the changes that have been made, even though there are still problems, and we talk about some of those here, but the baseline changes that have been made at least get it to the point where it probably should have been originally, in terms of if your heart is set on this case and the way this case looks, I'm not going to judge. I don't care. Like, if you're buying based on looks, go for it. Just as long as the case kind of hits the baseline functionality, does what it's advertised for, that's what we're really here for. So if you really love the way the case looks, that's the only way to make the price make sense. At $250, there are a lot of, we think, way better cases at or under $250. But hey, if you like how it looks, then this is a big improvement over what we saw last year. They're at least listening. I think where we're really going to see the changes manifest, or the sort of learnings from the first round of case reviews manifest, is going to be in the next case. So that's where we need to really look for TRYX, because there's realistically a limited set of options they have with this. They could have just shipped it and said, ah, fuck it, whatever, just put it out there. They could have done what they did, which is make some changes, hold it for like a year. It's a big thing to hold. Or they could have just not shipped it at all, but they probably already made the cases. So those are kind of their options without a total retooling. I think it's going to be case number 2 that we look at, where it's really going to be where they need to pull through on that one, because that's where all of the education should be in past the first case. But it looks like their panoramic cooler is pretty high ranked on Amazon, so I guess they're doing well in the cooler department. Maybe we'll look at one of those next. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Fun to do revisits like this. Subscribe for more to support us directly and our ability to produce independent reviews and coverage of products, and hopefully try to have something positive come out of them, like in this case, a lot of these changes. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to throw a few bucks our way every month. That helps a lot in being able to fund some of our investigative reports separately. And also check out our GNCA channel. All that's linked below. We'll see you all next time.